It started as a quiet Sunday walk, a 74-year-old black woman doing what she'd done every morning for years. But in seconds, it turned violent. One cop, one punch, and a coma that was never supposed to make headlines. What that officer didn't know: the woman he attacked has a son, and not just any son. He's the deputy attorney general, and he's about to expose everything the department tried to bury. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system built to silence, and a man willing to tear it apart to protect his mother. What happens next is a storm of justice, betrayal, and truth, one that'll shake you to the core. Let us know where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment, we'd love to hear from you. Eloise Turner had lived in Jefferson Square for over 40 years. Her small brick house, tucked beneath two towering sycamores, had seen generations grow and go. It wasn't the fanciest neighborhood, but it was home honest, old, and still lined with neighbors who left porch lights on and knew each other's names. Each morning, rain or shine, she took the same quiet walk around the block. It was her ritual. The cane she carried wasn't for show. Her hip gave her trouble some days, but she didn't let that slow her down. With her scarf wrapped neatly, her coat buttoned tight, and her head held high, she walked not like someone old, but someone with purpose. On that Thursday, the air was crisp, the sky soft gray, and the streets smelled faintly of pine from last night's rain. She was halfway through her route, about to pass the gas station on Jefferson and 4th, when something stopped her. Raised voices, sharp, aggressive. She looked ahead. Just outside the convenience store was a scene that made her chest tighten. A black teenager barely out of high school stood with his back to the wall, delivery bags slung off to one side. His hands were raised, fingers splayed. A police officer stood inches from his face, red-cheeked, chest puffed, yelling. The boy didn't move. He looked scared, not defiant, just stuck. His eyes kept darting toward the officer's hand, which hovered close to his holster. Eloise didn't need to hear the words to understand the danger. No one else was stepping in. The cashier watched nervously from behind the glass. Two pedestrians slowed, then kept walking, and the officer kept yelling, his voice escalating even though the boy wasn't talking back. Eloise gripped her cane harder. She could have walked on. Most people would have, but she had spent her whole life standing up in libraries, in classrooms, in school board meetings. She believed silence in the face of cruelty was complicity. So she stepped forward. "Excuse me, officer," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried clear, firm. The officer turned, his brow furrowed, annoyed at the interruption. "Ma'am, keep moving. This doesn't concern you." But Eloise held her ground. "I think it does," she said, a calmness in her tone that had stopped many a loud classroom. "That boy looks terrified." "What exactly has he done?" The officer stiffened. "He's loitering. I've asked him to leave." "He didn't." "Now he's resisting." The boy shook his head, silent, scared. "He doesn't look like he's resisting," Eloise said gently. "He looks like he's trying not to cry." And maybe it was that comment. Maybe it was the softness in her voice, the truth in her eyes, or the fact that she was just there, unafraid. But something in the officer's expression shifted. His jaw clenched, his eyes hardened. "Step back," he growled. "This is your last warning." She didn't step back. She stepped closer. "You don't have to be like this," she said. "You have a badge. That means something. You can choose to do better than this." That was the moment. He snapped. His fist flew without warning. It struck her cheek so hard it echoed. Eloise's head jerked to the side. Her cane slipped from her fingers. Her knees buckled. She crumpled. The back of her skull cracked against the curb with a sound that made even the people inside the store flinch. There was a gasp, a scream from across the street. A woman shouted, "Call 911! A man ran forward but stopped short, unsure what he could do without becoming the next target. The boy knelt beside her, hands shaking. "Miss? Miss, are you okay?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Blood seeped from a gash above her temple, soaking into her scarf. Her eyes fluttered, but didn't open. The officer stood over her, breathing heavy, pale now. "She came at me," he muttered. "She got in my space." But the phones were already out. Multiple angles, multiple witnesses. No matter how many times he repeated it, the video showed the truth. An elderly woman, unarmed, calm, punched unconscious by the very man who was supposed to serve and protect. The ambulance arrived within minutes. EMTs loaded Eloise onto a stretcher, stabilizing her as best they could. She was unconscious, unresponsive. Across town, in a corner office of the state's legal building, Julian Turner's phone rang. He almost didn't answer. He was buried in files, prepping for another corruption case. But when he saw the hospital's number, his stomach dropped. The voice on the other end was flat. Controlled, the kind that only delivers terrible news. "Miss Turner, your mother has been admitted head trauma. She's in critical condition." He didn't speak. Couldn't. The silence stretched. She was the victim of an assault. Julian stood, jacket already in hand. "Where?" he asked. "Jefferson Memorial Hospital. We'll have someone meet you in the ER." The drive blurred past. Every red light felt like a betrayal. His hands trembled on the wheel. He kept seeing her face in his head, smiling over tea, fussing about his shirts, laughing at her own jokes. The idea of her hurt bleeding was incomprehensible, but nothing prepared him for what he saw when he stepped into that ER. His mother, hooked up to machines, swollen. Still, a nurse spoke to him, but he didn't hear the words. Something about CT scans, swelling in the brain, sedation, 48-hour window. None of it made sense. He sat down next to her, his hand finding hers, cold, limp, and then it hit him. She wasn't just his mother. She was a woman assaulted in broad daylight. And he wasn't just her son. He was the Deputy Attorney General. And someone had just made the worst mistake of their life. This was no longer just personal. It was war. The hospital room was silent, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the low hum of machines working to keep Eloise Turner alive. Julian sat there beside her, still in his dress shirt and slacks. His blazer was tossed over a plastic chair. His tie hung loose around his neck, the knot uneven like he'd forgotten how to tie it. Maybe he couldn't remember the drive here, couldn't remember where he parked, just that she wasn't moving. His mother didn't look like herself. Her face was bruised, puffed. Her silver curls were matted with dried blood. A white bandage wrapped around her head. She looked fragile, and that word didn't belong to Eloise Turner. He couldn't take his eyes off her. His mother, the woman who raised him on library books, who marched for voter rights in '68, who never once let him quit anything, was now unconscious because some cop couldn't control his temper. He gripped her hand, cold, still. His phone buzzed again on the table. He ignored it. But it buzzed a second time, then a third. Finally, he picked it up. It was Greg Mason, his lead investigator. Loyal, efficient, brutally honest. "Julian," Greg said, skipping formalities, "you need to see this." Julian's voice was low. "What?" "There's footage. 3 different angles. 2 cell phone clips. One from the gas station's security camera. It's all over social already. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Your mom. She didn't do anything. Nothing aggressive. She just spoke to him. Julian didn't move. And he hit her. Hard. No provocation. Just snapped. It's bad." Julian closed his eyes, jaw tightening. He didn't need to see the video to know what it showed. His mother didn't raise her voice, didn't yell. She wouldn't have. She would have spoken calmly, like she always did, with reason and quiet conviction, and she'd gotten punished for it. How long before the department tries to spin this? He asked. They already have, Greg replied. Statement went out 20 minutes ago. Claims she interfered in an active investigation and quote-unquote escalated the situation. Julian stood up and walked into the hallway. The sterile white walls felt suffocating. He leaned against the wall, one hand pressed to his forehead. I want the name of the officer, he said. His record. His watch commander. Whoever drafted that press release. There was a pause. Julian, you sure you want to take this on personally? I'm not recusing myself, he said sharply. Your name's going to be in the papers, Greg warned. Conflict of interest. You know the playbook. They'll say you're doing this out of revenge. I am doing this because it's right, Julian snapped. And I don't trust anyone else to not screw this up. Greg was silent for a moment. I'll send what I have. But watch your step. The union's already circling the wagons. Julian ended the call and stepped back into the ICU. He pulled a chair up to the side of his mother's bed. The nurse had adjusted her pillows, tucked her blanket tighter. She looked peaceful. Peaceful didn't belong here. He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. Mom, it's me. No response. But he kept talking. They're saying you got in the way, that you caused this. But I know you, and I'm going to make sure they know you too. I'm going to make sure the whole damn country knows who you are. You didn't raise me to be quiet. You didn't survive everything you survived, so some uniform could put you down like you didn't matter. He brushed her hand gently. You matter. You always have, and I'm going to make sure the man who did this remembers your name for the rest of his life. She didn't move, but something inside him did. Back at his office that evening, Julian called a closed meeting with his most trusted staff, Greg, Lisa, his chief legal researcher, and Natalie, his courtroom strategist. 3 people. That's all he trusted. Right now. He played the video on the projector screen in the briefing room. No one spoke. They watched as Eloise stepped forward on the footage. Calm, measured. The officer identified now as Kyle Reddick was already aggressive, his voice loud, his posture tense. He looked like he wanted a reason to lash out. And then the punch, brutal, unprovoked, caught from multiple angles. Eloise didn't even flinch before it happened. Her cane fell first. Then her head hit the pavement. Greg exhaled. We can push this through internal affairs, but they'll stall. They always do. Julian shook his head. No internal review. We're pressing charges. Excessive force. Civil rights violation. And if the DA's office drags its feet, we'll file federally. Use every inch of the law. Lisa looked up. It's not just the punch. We've started pulling his record. Reddick's been named in 4 previous complaints, all brushed under the rug. One even involved a teen with a concussion. No action taken. Start documenting patterns. Julian ordered, we build from there. I want timelines. I want IA correspondence. I want to know who covered for him and why. Natalie spoke for the first time. You're taking on a police union. I know, Julian said. Good. That night, Julian sat in his office long after everyone left. He stared out over the city, Richmond's lights blinking in clusters beneath the stars. Somewhere out there, Officer Kyle Reddick was having dinner, watching TV, living his life. Julian's mother was in a hospital bed, fighting for hers. He swore under his breath. Not this time. Not again. He opened a file, typed out the words, People v. Kyle Reddick. This wasn't just about a punch. This was about a message. And Julian Turner was going to make sure it echoed from every courthouse wall in the state. The next morning, Julian walked into the Attorney General's office like a man marching into battle. His shoes echoed across the tile floors. His jaw was set. He didn't stop to say good morning. Not today. Inside the war room, the air was already thick with tension. Lisa was there, sleeves rolled, laptop open, a stack of manila folders fanned out like a crime scene. Greg leaned against the wall, nursing a half-drunk cup of black coffee and looking like he hadn't slept. Julian stepped in, set his briefcase down with a thud, and got straight to the point. "What do we have?" Lisa pushed a folder across the table toward him. "Officer Kyle Reddick, 10 years on the force, 7 excessive force complaints, 3 involving minors, 2 involving elderly citizens, all of them closed. 0 disciplinary actions," Greg added. 1 case from 2019. A 68-year-old man was shoved to the ground during a noise complaint, suffered a fractured wrist and a mild concussion, filed a report. Internal Affairs found no wrongdoing. The footage was somehow lost. Julian opened the folder. Inside were photocopied reports with long redacted sections, witness statements that ended abruptly, signatures that seemed too perfect to trust. One file had the word inconclusive, stamped in bold red across the top. "This is systemic," Julian muttered. "He wasn't just rogue. He was protected." Lisa nodded. "Same 3 supervisors show up in every report. Same union rep. The pattern's too clean to be coincidence." Julian stared at the names stamped on each review. "Chief Vincent Clay, Internal Affairs. Get me everything on Clay," he said. "Every case he's buried. Every officer he's cleared. I want a timeline. I want to see how deep this rabbit hole goes." Greg straightened up. "You're planning to link this to the broader corruption probe." "We're past planning," Julian said. "This is the crack we needed. Reddick isn't the whole problem. He's the pressure point." That afternoon, Julian called in Natalie. She arrived with 2 thick folders, one filled with civil rights precedent cases, the other with misconduct charges in state and federal courts. She didn't sit. She just laid them on the table and waited. Julian flipped through the pages. "How far can we go?" Natalie's voice was calm. "We can go state. We can go federal. If we want to open this up nationwide, we can even start building a pattern of violation under Section 1983. Julian glanced up. "And if we do, we hit not just the officer, but the city, the department, the command chain that protected him." He closed the folder. "Then we go federal. But we'll need a witness. Someone inside." Natalie nodded. "A whistleblower." Julian leaned back in his chair. That word whistleblower was both a lifeline and a curse. He'd seen what happened to the few who came forward, blackballed, harassed, transferred to graveyard shifts until they quit or were quietly pushed out. Finding someone willing to break the silence would be hard. Keeping them safe afterward would be harder. Greg returned 2 hours later with something unexpected, a voice recording from an anonymous officer. "We had someone reach out," he said. "Young, still new, scared, but he wanted to talk." Lisa pulled the video up on the projector. The face was blurred, the voice distorted, but the story was clear. Everybody knew Reddick was dangerous, the voice said, but nobody said anything. "You cross him, you don't get backup. Dispatch doesn't answer when you call. You get left out to dry." Julian's expression didn't change, but his hands curled into fists under the table. "I saw him rough up a kid once," the officer continued. "Threw him into a cruiser over a busted taillight. Kid didn't even resist, just stood there shaking. Reddick walked away clean. He always did." The room was silent when the video ended. Lisa looked at Julian. "That's our crack in the wall. Then we widen it," he said. Over the next 2 days, the office transformed into a war bunker. Lisa created a connection map, photos, reports, union memos, lines, and names covering every inch of the wall. Julian spent nights going through them, connecting dots the public never saw, complaints buried, camera footage malfunctioning, witnesses intimidated into silence. By Friday, they had 15 names, all officers, with records like Reddick's. Some worse. One had 3 fatalities under his belt, all ruled justifiable. One had settled 5 lawsuits, quietly paid out by the city. It was never just about Reddick. This was about a department that had rotted from the inside. But what made Julian lose sleep wasn't just the files. It was the thought of his mother. Eloise Turner had believed in the law. She had raised a son to believe in it too. And now that same law had to be turned against the people who abused it. Julian stood in front of the wall of evidence, late that night, alone. Red string connected names like arteries, bleeding across timelines and precincts. He pulled a new photo from the printer Reddick's department ID and pinned it to the center of the board. And then he wrote, in thick black marker beneath it, the first to fall. Word traveled fast. By Monday morning, the Richmond Police Department was in full containment mode. Emergency briefings were scheduled in every division. Union reps prowled the hallways like watchmen on a sinking ship. Talking points were handed out like ration cards. And somewhere in the thick of it all, Kyle Reddick sat alone in the break room, his badge suspended, his name spinning across headlines like a leaf caught in a storm. The footage hadn't faded. In fact, it was everywhere now. Local news, national morning shows, editorials, think pieces, TikToks, Twitter threads. They called him the cop who hit Grandma. That nickname stuck like tar. Reddick sat with his elbows on the table, staring blankly into his coffee. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. Over the weekend, his wife took the kids to her sister's place, said she needed space. His neighbors stopped waving. Someone had spray painted the word coward on his driveway. He washed it off at 2 a.m., barefoot, in the dark. At the station, no one spoke to him. Not the dispatch clerk. Not his patrol buddies. Not even the rookie he'd once helped pass firearms quals. He was radioactive now, unspoken, untouchable, unwanted. His phone buzzed. A message from his union contact. Keep your head down. Don't talk. Don't tweet. We'll take care of it. He wasn't so sure. Across town, Julian Turner's war room was humming with energy. A new caseboard now spanned the length of the wall. It no longer had just Reddick's name in the center, it had branches, sub-branches, a sprawling ecosystem of corruption mapped in red ink and string. Julian stood at the head of the table, his sleeves rolled, tie undone, voice steady but tight. He pointed to a folder Greg just handed him. Captain Mark Sellers, Greg said. The guy who handled 4 of Reddick's misconduct reviews quietly reassigned complaints, delayed internal interviews until officers forgot what they saw. Always found Reddick's conduct to be within protocol. Lisa tapped a second file. Sellers has been in internal affairs rotation for a decade. We checked his emails. He flagged a citizen complaint from a retired teacher filed the same week Eloise was assaulted, labeled it as inflammatory and lacking merit. The woman had bruises. Julian nodded slowly. They've been running cover for years. Reddick was never the outlier. He was the symptom. Meanwhile, inside the department, fractures were forming. Not everyone was standing behind the blue wall anymore. Younger officers, the ones who'd come in, hoping to change the system from the inside, were beginning to whisper. A few mid-level supervisors were quietly removing themselves from rotation, citing personal reasons. The fear had shifted. It was no longer about losing favor. It was about being dragged down with a sinking ship. Even Reddick could feel the pressure closing in. He tried to talk to his old partner, Steve, the guy who once vouched for him during a use of force inquiry. Steve didn't even stop walking. Didn't say a word. Just passed him, like he wasn't even there. Later that afternoon, Reddick sat across from his union-appointed attorney in a cramped, windowless room. "They're coming hard," the attorney said, tossing a printed news article onto the table. "Turner's team is 10 steps ahead. They've got videos, timelines, and now 2 officers willing to testify about internal cover-ups." Reddick's nostrils flared. This is political. That guy's making it personal. The lawyer didn't flinch. Doesn't matter. Because the narrative is airtight. You hit an elderly woman. You got filmed from 3 angles. Then Internal Affairs tried to sweep it under the rug. That's not a personal vendetta, Kyle. That's evidence. She came at me. No, she didn't. And the country watched her not come at you. Back at the AG's office, Julian pulled Lisa aside. "How's the outreach going?" he asked. "We've gotten tips from 3 more officers," she said. "Anonymous so far, but they're scared. They want to talk. They just don't want to be sacrificed. Find a way to protect them," Julian said. "If they're legit, I want them in front of a grand jury." Greg stepped in, holding a tablet. "You're going to want to see this." On the screen, a clip from a public hearing 3 years ago. A councilwoman, black, mid-50s, stood at a microphone warning city officials about unchecked police violence. Behind her sat Reddick, arms crossed, smirking. Julian watched in silence. "He's been getting away with it for years," Greg said. "And they let him." "Not anymore," Julian replied. Outside the station, protesters had begun to gather. Not just activists, not just students. It was everyone. Veterans, pastors, grandparents, nurses. They carried handmade signs with Eloise's face. They lit candles. They chanted softly, "Justice for Mrs. Turner." Inside the ICU, Eloise remained unconscious, her condition stable but unchanged. Julian still visited nightly. He sat by her bed, read her newspaper headlines, told her about the fight, and always before leaving he'd say the same thing. "Hang on, Mom, I'm not done yet." Julian Turner had built cases before. Big ones. Crooked sheriffs, kickback schemes, rigged bids, you name it. He'd put powerful men in prison. But this time, it was different. This time, the victim wasn't just a case number. She was his mother. And that meant every breath, every decision, every minute was wrapped in something deeper than justice. It was personal. It was sacred. By Tuesday, the office barely slept. His legal team rotated in shifts, like surgeons in a trauma ward. Natalie was locked in meetings with federal civil rights attorneys. Greg fielded calls from scared officers who didn't want their names public yet. Lisa combed through more than 10 years of internal affairs reports. The deeper they looked, the uglier it got. Lisa walked into the war room, carrying a box of handwritten complaints. Not official forms, just letters. Scribbled notes from people who never got callbacks. Folded photocopies. One was from a janitor who said Reddick slammed his head into a wall during a trespassing call. The man hadn't even resisted. Another was from a teacher who said Reddick followed her home after she asked to speak to a supervisor about his behavior during a student altercation. None of them made it past the front desk. "Buried," Lisa said. "Every single one." Julian flipped through the letters slowly, like they were sacred texts. "Keep documenting patterns. The jury's not going to believe what we say, they'll believe what we can show," Greg added. Whistleblower number 3's agreed to testify. Female officer. She says she saw Reddick punch a teenager during a traffic stop. The kid never reported it because his dad was undocumented and didn't want to risk attention. Julian didn't blink. Put her in protection. "We need her." At noon, Julian held his first press conference. He didn't want to, but Natalie was right. If he didn't control the narrative, someone else would. Standing behind the podium, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward, He spoke like a man not campaigning but warning. My mother is lying in a hospital bed, unconscious, beaten, and the man who did it wore a badge. This case is not about politics. It is about power, about the silence that surrounds abuse when it wears a uniform. He paused, letting the words settle. We're not just filing charges. We're exposing the network that let this happen. The questions came fast, too fast. But he didn't answer most of them. He wasn't there to debate. He was there to deliver a message. Back in his office, more statements rolled in. A former security guard who once worked outside a pharmacy said Reddick liked to drive by late at night, shining his spotlight into the eyes of teens waiting for rides. A retired school bus driver said Reddick stopped her once for rolling too slow and accused her of being high. She'd never touched a drug in her life. These weren't hardened criminals filing these complaints. These were teachers, bus drivers, grandmothers, people just like Eloise. Julian leaned over the table, both hands flat on the wood. It's not just about what Reddick did. It's about who he did it to and who let him do it over and over again. Greg nodded slowly. We're going to need federal muscle for this. Then get it, Julian said. We're not just charging him. We're setting precedent. But the pushback started to show. That night, Julian came home to find his mailbox open and torn. Inside was a single scrap of paper. Back off or we finish what he started. Natalie wanted to call the FBI. Julian said no, not yet. We file first. Then we deal with threats. He went back to work. At 3:47 a.m., he was still reviewing statements when Lisa dropped a bombshell on his desk, a printed thread online chatter from inside a private law enforcement forum. Officers talking openly about how to circle the wagons, how to discredit witnesses, how to find dirt on Eloise Turner's past. Julian stood up slowly. Get screen grabs. Archive everything. Then he walked out of the room and straight into the hospital. He sat beside his mother in the dark, the machines pulsing steady around her. He held her hand, watched her chest rise and fall. I'm sorry this happened to you, Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't there. But I promise you, the men who did this, the ones who cheered it, the ones who hid it, they're all going to know your name, not as a victim, as the reason they finally got exposed. And then he whispered the same words he had every night. I'm not done yet. The backlash came fast, and it came loud. By Wednesday morning, the police union was in full offensive mode. A row of podiums was set up outside the precinct. Blue uniforms lined up behind the spokesperson, like an army of quiet witnesses. Flags waved, cameras rolled, and in front of it all, a carefully rehearsed statement delivered with cold precision. This investigation is a politically motivated overreach. Officer Kyle Reddick has served this city with distinction for over a decade. He has risked his life for this community. He is being vilified by a media frenzy and a prosecutor with a personal agenda. The words hit local news within minutes. By lunchtime, they'd gone national. Julian watched the press conference from the office TV, with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. The union wasn't just defending Reddick. They were going after Julian, implying that he was too emotional, that he couldn't separate duty from family, that he was abusing his power. But Julian wasn't surprised. The union had money, media reach, and connections that stretched into every level of city politics. They weren't protecting Reddick because they believed he was innocent. They were protecting the system, because if he fell, if his misconduct was proven in court, everything they'd buried for years might come flooding into daylight. Greg came in with a file in hand and tossed it onto Julian's desk. You're not going to like this, he said. They're leaking stories. Julian opened the folder. Inside was a printed blog post from a so-called independent watchdog. The headline read, Who is Eloise Turner really? It claimed she was known for aggressive behavior, that she had a history of agitation, that she once harassed teens playing loud music and filed frequent nuisance complaints in her neighborhood. "They're painting her as confrontational," Lisa said, stepping into the room with a frown, trying to flip the narrative. "Make her the threat." Julian didn't respond. He stared at the article, his fingers tightening around the edge of the paper until it crinkled. "None of that's true," Natalie said quietly. "And even if it was, it wouldn't justify what happened to her." "They know that," Julian replied. "This isn't about truth. It's about perception. Discredit her, so they can justify him." Outside the building, pressure was mounting. A well-known state senator held a press event that afternoon. "We ask that the Attorney General's office proceed with caution," he said. "Policing is under immense strain. We should not let one incident derail the trust between law enforcement and the public." A councilman called Julian's investigation divisive and inflammatory. On social media, the hashtags shifted. Alongside hashtag Justice for Eloise came new ones. Hashtag Back the Blue. Hashtag Thin Blue Line. Hashtag Witch Hunt. Julian didn't care about hashtags. But then, the pressure got real. He was summoned to a closed-door meeting with the Attorney General himself, a man he respected, a man who had mentored him in the early years. Now, the older man sat across from him, suit immaculate, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," the AG said. Julian's reply was quiet. "I didn't stir it. I uncovered it. You've made enemies. I've made a case." The AG sighed. "There are calls for your recusal. From lawmakers, from the union, even from some of our own advisors. I'm not stepping down. You might not have a choice." The union's threatening to pull cooperation from several citywide policing programs. That means stalled investigations, delayed responses, protests, chaos. Julian leaned forward. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't see the threats? I get them every day. Emails, phone calls, notes in my mailbox." The AG's voice lowered. "Julian, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying they're going to burn everything down before they let you win." Julian stood slowly. "Then let them light the match. I'm not backing off." Back at the office, morale was strained. Some junior staffers began asking questions. Was this worth it? Could they survive it politically? Lisa overheard one intern say they were scared to go home in their badge-bearing car. Greg stayed late that night. "They're trying to isolate you," he told Julian. "Push you into a corner. Break you." Julian looked up from his desk. "They already tried that once. The night they put my mother in a coma." He walked over to the evidence wall. Red strings stretched between names, dates, events now joined by newspaper clippings and union press statements. Lisa had added a new label. "Disinformation campaign. Active. They're trying to turn the public," she said. "Then we turn them back," Julian replied. That night, he gave an interview on a national evening show. Not flashy, not rehearsed, just a quiet conversation with a trusted anchor. He told the story about his mother, about the investigation, about what it meant. She wasn't a protester. She wasn't confrontational. She was a librarian, a mother, a community elder, and she didn't deserve to be assaulted by a man with a badge. The next morning, a woman in Georgia posted a video with tears in her eyes, holding a copy of Eloise's favorite book. "I never met her," she said, "but she reminds me of my grandmother. We can't let them bury her story." The video went viral. By noon, there were new headlines, new hashtags. "We remember Eloise," hashtag truth over power. Julian saw them on his feed but didn't smile. He wasn't fighting for noise. He was fighting for truth. And truth, he knew, always makes the powerful panic. The twist didn't come in a headline or a viral video. It came in a folder thin, creased, nearly discarded. Lisa found it while combing through archived materials from a closed civil rights case the team had flagged weeks ago. It was misfiled, forgotten, but it shouldn't have been. Julian was deep in case law when Lisa stormed into his office. Her face was pale, but focused. "I think I found something," she said. Julian sat up. "Talk to me." She handed him the folder. Terrence Holloway, black male, 39 years old, died during a traffic stop 5 years ago, ruled as an overdose on the spot. No video. No follow-up. Julian opened the report. "What made you pull this?" Lisa pointed to the bottom of the incident summary. "The officer who made first contact, Reddick." Julian's eyes narrowed. She continued, flipping pages. "Here's where it gets interesting. Autopsy report says no narcotics in the bloodstream. Toxicology came back clean. So how'd they justify overdose? They didn't. They never filed a correction. Just wrote it off and closed the case. Family tried to appeal. Internal Affairs responded with, 'Family appears unstable, not credible.' Julian didn't say anything. Then he saw it, buried in the IA notes, scribbled in red pen, case reviewed by Captain M. Sellers, final determination, natural causes. Greg stepped in just as Julian closed the file. Terrence Holloway, Julian said. He didn't overdose. He was killed, and they buried it. Greg scanned the report 5 years ago. No body cam footage. No official record of disciplinary review. This one was scrubbed. Who buried it? Julian asked. Lisa was already on it. Captain Sellers. Same man who signed off on 4 of Reddick's use of force cases. I cross-checked the timestamps. Every case that showed signs of excessive violence but disappeared, Sellers was the signatory. Julian stood, his voice low. We need to find the family. Within hours, they located Terrence Holloway's sister, Monique. She lived just outside Richmond, in a modest brick home with flower beds out front and wind chimes by the porch light. She was in her early 40s, wore her hair in thick braids, and answered the door with weary eyes. Julian introduced himself and explained why they were there. Monique looked stunned at first, but she didn't cry. I knew it, she said softly. I knew he didn't do anything wrong. Inside, over coffee, she told them everything. Terrence had just gotten a promotion at work. He had plans to move to Charlotte. The night he died, he was driving home from a friend's place. No alcohol, no drugs, just a broken taillight. They said he collapsed. She said that he had drugs in his system and a weak heart. But my brother ran 5 miles every morning. He didn't even drink soda. She showed Julian the letter she'd written to Internal Affairs. Dated 2019. Never answered. They shut me down, she said. Called me hysterical. Said I was interfering with a closed case. Julian asked the question he'd been dreading. Do you remember the officer's name? Monique nodded slowly. Reddick. That was the one who knocked on my door. Julian closed his eyes. There it was. A second victim. A second cover-up. And a pattern. When they got back to the office, Natalie was waiting. We have to reopen Holloway's death, she said. If we can prove Reddick falsified his report, or if Sellers helped bury it, it changes everything. Julian agreed. We'll build parallel charges. Wrongful death. Civil rights violations. Criminal cover-up, Lisa added. We also just got a hit on Sellers' financials. There's an unreported deposit 2 months after Holloway's case closed. $10,000. From a private security consulting firm that contracts with the department. Greg raised his brows. Bribe? Looks like hush money, Julian exhaled. We're not just exposing a rogue cop anymore. We're exposing a system. That night, Julian sat alone in his office, staring at the wall of evidence. Reddick's photo was no longer at the center. Now it shared space with Monique's handwritten letter, with Terrence's autopsy, with IA logs that reeked of coordinated silence. He felt the gravity shift. This wasn't about one act of brutality. This was about institutional rot. He picked up the phone and called the U.S. Attorney's office. "I need a meeting," he said. "We're opening a second case. And this time, we're not just charging a cop, we're charging the people who helped him hide." The courthouse steps were packed. Protesters holding signs. Reporters waving microphones. Cameras stacked shoulder to shoulder, their lenses aimed like rifles. Julian stood still for a moment at the base of those granite stairs, staring up at the building like it was the heart of a machine, cold, slow, but about to awaken. Inside, everything was ready. After weeks of gathering evidence, reviewing testimonies, and piecing together two stories that had been buried in silence, the grand jury had spoken. Officer Kyle Reddick would face trial for two major charges: felony aggravated assault for the attack on Eloise Turner, and obstruction of justice for his role in the death of Terrence Holloway. As Julian walked through the courthouse doors, flanked by his team, the world behind him seemed to fade. Everything now came down to what happened inside that room. The trial opened with a whisper, no theatrics, no shouting, just the slow rhythm of protocol. And then, the video. The screen showed the moment Eloise Turner stepped into view. 3 different angles. The boy against the wall. Reddick, towering, her calm voice silent in the footage, but evident in her body language. The sudden movement, his fist, her fall. The courtroom fell into absolute stillness. Even the judge leaned forward. The jury didn't look away. The punch was hard to watch, not just because of the violence, but because of the silence that followed it. That hollow thud, that flash of gray hair, that stillness. Then came the witnesses. First, the boy Eloise tried to protect. 17, nervous in the witness chair, but resolute. She didn't yell, he said. She didn't touch him. She just asked why he was being rough with me. He described, the moment her body hit the ground, I thought she was dead. I didn't know what to do. She dropped like her legs stopped working. Next came Monique Holloway. She didn't cry. My brother was 39 years old, worked for the county, ran every morning, didn't drink, didn't smoke. That night, he was pulled over for a broken taillight. 2 hours later, I was signing paperwork to release his body. She showed the letter she had written to Internal Affairs. 4 pages. 4 pages of questions and pain, and they never even responded. The defense tried to paint a different picture. They said Officer Reddick had a clean record. Despite the allegations, they said Eloise escalated. They said Terrence Holloway had a history of anxiety. Julian waited for his moment. When he rose, his voice was soft but deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, this case is not about fear, it is about choices. He walked slowly in front of them. Officer Reddick had choices. When an elderly woman asked a question, he could have responded. He could have explained. He could have de-escalated. Instead, he raised his fist. He paused. When Terrence Holloway was pulled over, the department had choices. They could have investigated properly, preserved the footage, told the truth. Instead, they buried it. Why? He turned to the jury, because if they didn't, it would show a pattern of power without restraint, of silence as a weapon. The courtroom was quiet. Then came Julian's final witness, a former officer from Reddick's unit, a white man, early 40s, 10 years on the force. He sat down, took the oath, and looked directly at Julian. I saw it happen, he said, not just with Eloise, not just with Terrence. There were others. The courtroom gasped. I filed complaints. They disappeared. I spoke to my supervisor. He told me, if you like your pension, keep your mouth shut. Julian didn't need to say anything else. The witness said it all. By the end of the day, the jury looked different. They didn't lean back. They didn't fidget. They leaned in. They looked angry, focused, changed. Julian knew he had done his job, but he also knew that justice wasn't guaranteed. That night, as the city buzzed with news coverage and speculation, Julian returned to the hospital. His mother was still unconscious. The same machines beeped their steady rhythm. The nurses greeted him quietly. He sat down beside her and took her hand. "We're close, Mom," he whispered. "They heard you. Through all of this, they heard you." And for a second, just for the briefest moment, he thought he felt her fingers twitch. He didn't say anything. He just stayed, because tomorrow, the jury would decide what kind of world they wanted to live in. And for tonight, he just wanted to remember why he started. The verdict came down on a Thursday. The courthouse was packed, the air so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. Every bench was filled community leaders, journalists, families, strangers. Protesters stood outside in the cold, holding signs that read, "Justice for Eloise," and "Say his name, Terrence Holloway." No one knew what would happen. Hope hung in the air, but so did dread. Julian stood at the prosecution table, his posture calm, but his fingers laced tightly behind his back. This wasn't his first trial, but it was the first where everything, absolutely everything, felt like it hung on the next few words. The bailiff handed the verdict to the judge. The judge read silently, then nodded to the foreperson. In the matter of the People versus Officer Kyle Reddick, the foreperson said, standing with a folded paper in hand. Her voice was steady, her eyes unreadable. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of felony aggravated assault in the case of Miss Tauf Eloise Turner." There was a sharp gasp in the room. Someone in the back whispered, "Finally," but the foreperson wasn't finished. "We find the defendant not guilty of obstruction of justice in the case of Mr. Terrence Holloway." The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was confusion. Julian's jaw clenched. Greg shifted in his seat behind him. Lisa looked down at the table. Natalie let out a slow breath and whispered, "Damn it!" Monique Holloway sat perfectly still. No tears. No reaction. She looked like someone who had already buried the possibility of justice long ago. Reddick didn't flinch. His lawyer squeezed his shoulder, whispering something in his ear. The officer nodded slowly, his mouth tight. The judge dismissed the jury. Outside, the headlines wrote themselves, "Officer convicted, but escapes justice for Holloway death. Split verdict raises questions in high-profile trial. Julian Turner delivers win. But is it enough?" Julian stepped outside and was immediately surrounded by microphones. "Do you consider this a victory?" One reporter shouted, "Will you appeal the obstruction verdict? Did the jury fail Mr. Holloway?" He didn't answer. He walked straight to his car. Back at the office, the mood was quiet. Staffers moved like shadows. No one played music. No one cracked jokes. Julian sat at his desk, staring at the wall where evidence still hung photos of Eloise in the library, Terrence Holloway on his birthday, witness statements, IA cover-ups, timelines. It was all still there. Still true. Greg entered quietly and closed the door behind him. "You did everything you could," he said. "I know," Julian replied, "but it still feels wrong." Greg didn't answer. He didn't need to. Lisa stopped by later. "The Holloway family's asking for a meeting. They just want to talk." Julian nodded. Tomorrow, that night, he went to the hospital. Eloise was still unconscious, but stable, her breathing soft. A nurse had braided her silver hair, and someone had left a card from a local school. It read, "Thank you for protecting the truth." Julian sat beside her and took her hand. "They convicted him, Mom," he said. "But not for everything. Just enough to quiet the noise. Not enough to fix the silence." He paused. "I'm tired. I won't lie. I'm tired of the fight. Tired of the politics. Tired of people calling this a win when it doesn't feel like one." He looked at her face. "You raised me. to fight for what's right. But what if right doesn't win? The room was quiet, just the steady beep of the monitors. He stayed there for almost 2 hours. The next morning, he met with the Holloway family in a private conference room. Monique arrived with her mother, an older woman with trembling hands and eyes that looked permanently swollen from tears shed years ago. Julian sat across from them. "I'm sorry we couldn't give you more," he said. Monique nodded. "You gave us something. A voice, but no justice," her mother said, barely above a whisper. "No," Julian replied. "Not yet." After they left, Natalie approached him with a folder. "We have legal grounds for appeal," she said. "There's new witness chatter. One of Reddick's former supervisors has come forward quietly. He's willing to testify about Holloway's case being buried." Julian looked at her. "We go back in?" he asked. "That's your call." He was quiet for a long time. Then he stood. "Call the press. I'll issue a statement." "We're not done," Natalie smiled. "I didn't think we were." He walked back into his office, pulled the Holloway file from the shelf, and laid it out on the desk again. The city had given him a partial win, but partial wasn't enough. Not for Eloise, not for Terrence, not for justice. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. Julian had barely touched his coffee when the call came. The screen flashed St. Mary's Hospital. His heart stopped for a second. "Miss Turner," the nurse said, her voice gentle but urgent. "She's awake." He didn't ask how. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just ran. When he arrived, he barely noticed the way the security guards smiled at him or how the nurses nodded as he passed. He pushed open the ICU doors and froze. Eloise was awake. She was sitting up slightly, supported by pillows. Her eyes were open, alert, her skin pale, but warm with life. And when she really saw him, she smiled. Just a little, but it was real. Julian couldn't move. He stood in the doorway, like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. Then slowly, as though afraid it might all vanish, he walked over and took her hand. "Hi, Mom," he whispered. She squeezed his fingers, weak but steady. He blinked hard. All the words he had prepared, the promises, the pain, the anger, they fell away. "I thought I lost you," he said. "You didn't," she rasped. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were strong. He stayed by her side for hours. He told her everything about the case, the protests, the verdict. He told her about Terrence Holloway, about the fight, about the nights he didn't sleep, and the mornings he wondered if he was making any difference. She listened, silent, watching him. Her hand never left his, and when he finished, she looked out the window and whispered, "It's not over, is it?" "No," he said, "but we're closer than we've ever been." A week later, a new witness came forward, a clerk from Internal Affairs, who had been there 5 years ago when the Holloway case was closed. She had filed the original paperwork. She had watched it be altered, then disappear. She came forward, terrified but determined. That was the break they needed. Julian's office reopened the obstruction case. This time, there was no gray area, no uncertainty, no mercy. The courtroom was quieter than the first time. The public attention was even greater, but the tension had changed. People weren't unsure anymore. They were watching to see justice finally arrive. The new jury heard everything. The altered evidence, the deleted video logs, the hush money paid through shell organizations. Testimony from the Internal Affairs clerk landed like a hammer. "They told me to label it as closed. They said the family was unstable, that if I asked questions, I'd be transferred, so I stopped asking." Reddick sat motionless through most of the trial, jaw clenched, his lawyer doing damage control that barely mattered anymore. The illusion of authority had cracked. What remained was a man who had finally run out of lies. to hide behind. The jury came back in 2 hours. Guilty. Obstruction of justice. Evidence tampering. Conspiracy to suppress investigation. 3 counts. Julian didn't celebrate. He just stood, looked across the room at Monique Holloway, and nodded. She nodded back. They both knew it wasn't enough to bring Terrence back, but it was enough to finally say what happened to him mattered, and that mattered more than anything. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. When Julian stepped outside, they clapped not like a celebrity, like a man who had carried something heavy for all of them and finally set it down. Reporters shouted questions. He gave them one sentence. Justice took too long, but it came. Later that evening, Julian returned to the hospital. Eloise was sitting up more now. She had a book in her lap, a gift from the children at the school she once visited. When he walked in, she looked up and smiled again, stronger this time. "They got him," Julian said. She nodded. "I know. I watched. You did." They played the trial on the hospital TVs. He laughed for the first time in weeks. She reached for his hand. "I'm proud of you." He looked down. "I don't feel proud. I just feel relieved." "That's part of justice, too," she said. Letting go, he sat with her, and for once, didn't talk about evidence or witness protection or next steps. He just talked about her garden, about the neighbors who'd sent letters, about the librarian who had written to say Eloise had inspired her to stand up to a school board. Outside the window, the city moved quietly, but something had changed. The Attorney General announced a full-scale audit of internal affairs. Julian's team was asked to draft new policies on transparency and officer accountability. The police union issued a statement carefully worded, but apologetic, and in communities across Richmond, people talked not in whispers anymore, but in full voice. The silence had been broken. A month later, Eloise was released from the hospital. When she stepped outside, there were neighbors lined up along the sidewalk. Some waved, some cried, some just placed a hand over their heart. She didn't say much. She just smiled, and in her son's eyes, that smile said everything. That night, Julian sat alone in his apartment. He looked out the window, down at the courthouse across the street, and he let himself cry, not because of pain, but because for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying it alone. Stories like this one aren't just about courtrooms and verdicts. They're about people, about voices that were silenced for too long finally being heard, about a mother's strength, even when unconscious, and a son's relentless pursuit of justice, not just for her, but for an entire community that had learned to live in fear of silence. Eloise Turner reminded us that even the quietest voices can spark change. That's speaking up, asking questions, and standing in the gap between power and people matters. Julian reminded us that justice isn't a moment, it's a commitment, a long, exhausting journey that doesn't always end in applause, but always begins with courage. If you take one thing away from this story, let it be this: the truth always matters, and even when the system tries to bury it, it finds a way to rise. Maybe you've lived through your own version of this story. Maybe you've felt overlooked, dismissed, hurt. But let this be a reminder: it's never too late to speak out or to help someone else find their voice. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or made you believe, even for a moment, that change is still possible, then we invite you to help us keep sharing it. Give this video a like. Share it with someone who still believes in justice. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel, because we're not done telling stories that matter. And remember, no matter your age, your voice still counts, and your story still matters. Always.